Fiscal policy for development. So this presentation is consist of three topics. In topic number 1, we'll talk about the macro stability and resource mobilization. In topic number 2, taxation, direct and indirect. And in topic number 3, the principal sources of direct and indirect public tax revenues. Macro stability and resource mobilization. Macro stability or the macroeconomic stability exists when key economic relationships are in balance. For example, between domestic demand and output, the balance of payments, fiscal revenues and expenditure, and savings and investment. These relationships, however, need not necessarily be in exact balance. Resource mobilization, on the other hand, is when a business or organization secures new or additional resources to meet needs. This process can also include strategies that maximize the efficiency of existing resources. Financial policy. It deals with money, interest, and credit allocation. Fiscal policy focuses on government taxation and expenditures. Together, they represent the bulk of public sector activities. Most stabilization attempts have concentrated on cutting government expenditures to achieve budgetary balance. But the burden of resource mobilization to finance essential public developmental efforts must come from the revenue side. Public domestic and foreign borrowing can fill some savings gaps. In the long run, it is the efficient and equitable collection of taxes on which governments must base their development aspirations. In the absence of well-organized and locally controlled money markets, most developing countries have had to rely primarily on fiscal measures to stabilize the economy and to mobilize domestic resources. Taxation, direct and indirect. Direct taxes, those levied on private individuals, corporations, and property, make up 20% to 40% of total tax revenue for most developing countries. And on the other hand, indirect taxes, such as import and export duties, value-added tax or VATs, excise taxes, and sales taxes, constitute the primary source of fiscal revenue for most developing countries. This illustration shows the tax to GDP ratios of different countries. Some of the key observations include: Denmark had the highest tax to GDP ratio in 2021, which is 46.9%, and with the exceptions of 2017 and 2018, in which France was higher, has had the highest tax to GDP ratio of OECD countries since 2002. France had the second highest tax to GDP ratio in 2021, which is 45.1%. Mexico had the lowest tax to GDP ratio, which is 16.7%. Of the 36 countries for which data for 2021 are available, the ratio of tax revenues to GDP rose in 24, remained unchanged in 1, and fell in 11 compared with 2020. The largest fall in the tax to GDP ratio between 2020 and 2021 was in Hungary at 2.1 percentage point, due to falls in revenues from all major tax types as a share of GDP. In particular, a decline of 1 percentage point in social security contributions. Changes in the tax to GDP ratio are driven by the relative changes in nominal tax revenues and in nominal GDP. Let's take a look at the tax to GDP ratio of the Philippines. The tax to GDP ratio of the Philippines was reported at 12.9% in December 2022. This records a decrease from the previous number of 16.1% for September 2022. Developed countries of OECD collect a much higher percentage of GDP in the form of tax revenue than developing countries do. Developed countries may have higher demand for public expenditures and also greater capacity to generate tax revenue, and thus the causality likely runs in the large part from greater development to higher tax levels. But to the degree that the government resources are spent wisely, such as on human capital and needed infrastructure investments, some of the causality may run the other way as well. The main purpose of taxation is the mobilization of resources to finance public expenditures. Whatever the prevailing political or economic ideology of the less developed country, its economic and social progress depends largely on its government's ability to generate sufficient revenues to finance an expanding program of essential, non-revenue yielding public services, health, education, transport, legal and other institutions, poverty alleviation, and other components of the economic and social infrastructure. Many developing countries face problems of large fiscal deficits. public expenditures greatly in excess of public revenues, resulting from a combination of ambitious development programs and unexpected negative external shocks. With rising debt burdens, falling commodity prices, growing trade imbalances, and declining foreign private and public investment inflows, developing country governments had little choice but to undergo severe fiscal retrenchment. This meant cutting government expenditures, mostly on social services, and raising revenues through increased or more efficient tax collections. The taxation potential of a country depends on five factors. 1. The level of per capita real income. 2. The degree of inequality in the distribution of that income. Number 3. The industrial structure of the economy and the importance of different types of economic activity. 4. The social, political, and institutional setting and the relative power of different groups. 5. The administrative competence, honesty, and integrity of the tax-gathering branches of government. The principal sources of direct and indirect public tax revenues. Personal income yield much less revenue as a proportion of GDP in less developed than in more developed nations. In the latter, the income tax structure is said to be progressive. People with higher incomes theoretically pay a larger percentage of that income in taxes. Property taxes can be an efficient and administratively simple mechanism both for generating public revenues and for correcting gross inequalities in income distribution. Corporate income taxes. Taxes on corporate profits of both domestically and foreign-owned companies amount to less than 3% of GDP in most developing countries, compared to more than 6% in developed nations. Developing country governments tend to offer a wide variety of tax incentives and concessions to manufacturing and commercial enterprises. Indirect taxes on commodities. These taxes, which individuals and corporations pay indirectly through their purchase of commodities, are relatively easy to assess and collect. This is especially true in the case of foreign traded commodities, which must pass through a limited number of frontier ports and are usually handled by a few wholesalers. Conventional wisdom in recent years has been that switching to a broad-based value-added tax or the VAT would improve economic efficiency. Encouraged by development agencies, such tax reforms have accordingly been undertaken in many developing countries. Value-added tax are those that are levied on the value added at each stage of production process. Problems of tax administration. In the final analysis, a developing nation's ability to collect taxes for public expenditure programs and to use the tax system as a basis for modifying the distribution of personal incomes will depend not only on the enactment of appropriate tax legislation, but also on the efficiency and integrity of the tax authorities who must implement these laws. The ability of governments in developing countries to expand their tax nets to cover the higher income groups and minimize tax evasion by local and foreign individuals and corporations will largely determine the efficiency of the tax system in achieving its dual function of generating sufficient public revenues to finance expanding development programs and preventing an undue burden on lower income groups in order to reduce poverty and income inequality. Conclusion. Without taxes, governments would be unable to meet the demands of their societies. Taxes are crucial because governments collect this money and use it to finance social projects. The most important purpose of taxation is to raise resources for governments to deliver essential public services. Next to being a source of revenue, taxation has the potential to be a powerful tool for stimulating development in a country. State-owned enterprises and privatization. State-owned enterprises or SOEs are public corporations owned and operated by the government. In addition to their traditionally dominant presence in utilities like gas, water, and electricity, transportation like railroads, airlines and buses, and communications like telephone, telegraph, and postal services, SOEs have been active in such key sectors as large-scale manufacturing, construction, finance, services, natural resources, and agriculture. SOEs have played a major role in the economies of developing nations, historically contributing an average of 7 to 5% of their GDP. To have a better understanding, let's take a look at this video about the SOEs in one of the developing countries, which is the China.
Every year during graduation season, graduates are busy feeling sad about leaving and struggling with their future prospects. Companies large and small are also busy recruiting and enriching their harems. No, their teams. State-owned enterprises are the dream of many graduates. There are legends that state-owned enterprises have good treatment and high welfare, commonly known as the Iron Rice Bowl. However, state-owned enterprises, do you really know? State-owned enterprises generally refer to enterprises invested or controlled by the central or federal government of the state. In China, these are also called central enterprises such as CNPC, Sinopec, China Telecom, China Mobile, and China Unicom. In addition to central enterprises, we also have local state-owned enterprises. Have you heard of GRI, that Master's Core Technology? From the end of the Qing Dynasty to the Republic of China, there were many government-established enterprises. Yes, this is the prototype of our state-owned enterprises. At that time, we were still a backward agricultural country. To achieve rapid industrialization to enhance national strength and resist invaders, relying only on private capital to complete primitive accumulation is certainly not as fast as the government. But we all know the true face of the government at that time. State-owned enterprises have become enterprises that not only do not seek profit for the people, but also compete with the people. After the founding of the People's Republic of China, freedom alone would not be able to change the backwardness of the country. To catch up with Western countries, it still depends on the country to invest in construction. The difference is at this time the people are in charge. In addition to the enterprises confiscated, redeemed, and previously established in the base areas, the central and local governments have also set up many state-owned enterprises to build industrial projects. These state-owned enterprises became the dominant part of the strategy of giving priority to the development of heavy industry at that time. Whether it was the restoration of the national economy after the war or the construction of socialism afterwards, they were indispensable everywhere. In my country, in addition to supporting important industries with large investment, high risk, and in the long term, state-owned enterprises actually have many identities. For example, they are social builders, food producers, energy miners, trade operators, and technology developers. They are needed for stable economic development. They are needed to advance the modernization process. They are needed for scientific and technological innovation and international competition. And they are also needed to protect the common interests of the whole people. Wait a minute, do you really think that there were no state-owned enterprises in ancient times? Naive. In the spring and autumn period, Guangzhou initiated the salt and iron state monopoly system. The state-owned enterprises actually existed for a long time. Just as the market economy is neither surnamed capitalism nor socialism, state-owned enterprises are also common in capitalist countries, especially after World War II. State-owned enterprises also help them survive the hard times of post-war reconstruction and economic crisis. Similarly, state-owned enterprises in Western countries are also concentrated in some industries and sectors such as infrastructure, cutting-edge industries, and scientific research projects. For example, by the end of 2016, the total length of high-speed rail lines built by the China Railway Corporation reached 22,000 kilometers, ranking first in the world. In addition, the J-20 fighter manufactured by China Chengdu Aircraft Industry Group is the world's fourth fifth-generation fighter, and China is the third country in the world to have a fifth-generation fighter. This kind of major project can only be held by state-owned enterprises with sufficient funds and cutting-edge technology. That's right, state-owned enterprises often do exactly what private enterprises cannot solve and that are related to people's livelihood. State-owned enterprises play a great role and have heavy responsibilities and naturally expose many problems. In the past, state-owned enterprises had problems like rigidity of systems, and later problems such as poor management, lack of vitality, and low efficiency often recurred. Coupled with the rapid development of private enterprises and the impact of changes in the domestic and foreign economic environment at that time, the treatment effect of the traditional supervision and business model of state-owned enterprises was obviously not very good. Fortunately, the country has not given up treatment, and the reform of state-owned enterprises has been deepening. However, it is impossible for reform to cure the disease immediately, and new diseases will still appear. The lack of professional managers of state-owned enterprises, the unreasonable organizational structure of state-owned enterprises, and the state-owned asset management system still need to be improved. The functional positioning of different types of state-owned enterprises still needs to be refined, and the problem of the property rights system still needs to be solved urgently. It seems that the treatment method called reform shall not be stopped.
Given the strategic role state-owned enterprises play in the economies of developing countries and their demand on scarce resources, it is important to understand the reasons for their creation and the measures that might be undertaken to improve their efficiency and to help them meet their economic and social objectives. So now we will tackle some of the rationale for the creation of SOEs. and one is the persistence of monopoly power in many developing countries. Direct government control has been intended to ensure that prices are not set above the marginal cost of producing the output. Moreover, as was also mentioned, certain goods that have a high social benefit are usually provided at a price below their cost or even free. Hence, the private sector has no incentive to produce such goods, and the government must assume responsibility for their provision. The second rationale for the creation of SOEs is capital formation, which is particularly important at the early stages of development, when private savings are very low. Investment in infrastructure at this point is crucial to lay the groundwork for further investment, and the SOEs remain important at later stages in industries that require massive funds. The lack of private incentives to engage in promising economic activities because of factors such as uncertainty about the size of local markets, unreliable sources of supply, and the absence of technology and skilled labor is a third major rationale for creating public enterprises. Improving the performance of SOEs. Despite these arguments, SOEs have come under sustained attack for wasting resources. SOEs make significant demands on government finance, as well as on domestic and foreign credit. In many cases, the level of these demands is related to low profitability and inefficiency. Although it is difficult to generalize across countries, data from the World Bank for state-owned enterprises in 24 developing countries revealed only a small operating surplus. Several factors contribute to the overall poor performance of SOEs in terms of profitability and efficiency. Perhaps the most important is that SOEs differ from private firms in that they are expected to pursue both commercial and social goals. Providing goods at prices below cost in an effort to subsidize the public or hiring extra workers to meet national employment objectives inevitably reduces profitability. Another factor adversely affecting the profitability and the efficiency of SOEs is the over-centralization of their decision making, which allows little flexibility for managers in the everyday operation of the firm. Options for reform. One of these is the reorganization, wherein decentralizing decision making to allow for more flexibility and providing better incentives for managers could increase production efficiency. Second one is privatization. It is a transfer of ownership and control from the public to the private sector. So let us now move to privatization. So what is privatization? It is a process of transferring an enterprise or industry from the public sector to the private sector. The privatization of state-owned enterprises in the production and financial sectors hinges the neoclassical hypothesis that private ownership brings greater efficiency and more rapid growth. During the 1980s and 1990s, privatization was actively promoted by major international bilateral, like you said, and multilateral agencies like World Bank and IMF. Privatization has apparently been successful in promoting greater efficiency and higher output in many cases, but many privatized assets were concentrated in the hands of small groups of local and international elites. Privatization has also been resorted to as a quick fix for fiscal deficits, but when the easy candidates for privatization have been exhausted, governments in developing countries have often found that the fiscal problems have returned. Privatization therefore raises many complex issues. There are questions of feasibility, appropriate financing, the structure of legal and property rights, the role of competing elites and interest groups, like public officials and bureaucrats, versus domestic and foreign private business interests, and whether or not widespread privatization promotes or ultimately weakens existing dualistic economic, social, and political structures. It is not sufficient to claim that privatization can lead to higher profits, greater output, or even lower cost. Let us now move to public administration, the scarcest resource. Public administration is a field in which leaders serve communities to advance the common good and effect positive change. Public administration professionals are equipped with skills to manage at all levels of government, which are local, state, and federal, as well as non-profit organizations. Many observers would argue that the shortage of public and private administrative capability is the single scarcest public resource in the developing world. The problem is not just lack of training or experience. It also arises out of the political instability of numerous developing countries. When power is constantly changing hands, considerations of efficiency and public welfare are likely to be subordinated to political loyalty. Moreover, the larger the group of officials affected by a change of power, the more difficult it will be to maintain continuity in the formulation and execution of policy. Public administration is unlikely to function efficiently when the rule of law is in question, when there is a public disorder, or when there is a little consensus on fundamental issues. Acute conditions of class, tribal, or religious conflict within a society will usually be reflected in the management and operation of government departments and public. Many governments in developing countries may also have civil service goals other than performance. That may include to break up traditional elites, to nationalize the civil service, to conform the ideological correctness, to reflect or favor an ethnic ratio, or to include or exclude minorities. Most governments are also organized in the traditional hierarchical form, but some have experimented with negative hierarchy, which is from bottom to top, adhocracy, temporary arrangements, and polyarchy, which is cooperation with outside organizations. This last being attempted particularly when some special form of expertise is. Some bureaucracies in developing countries are relatively overstaffed at the bottom and understaffed at the top. There is a chronic shortage of skilled, competent managers capable of independent decision making. The greater the number of parastatal organizations set up, the more state owned enterprises and nationalized industries, quasi governmental bodies, development corporations, and training institutions, the thinner this layer of managers is spread. In the case of nationalized industries, most experiments have been economically disastrous and have resulted in all kinds of strains within the central civil service. Personnel systems in the public service are usually not adequate for the increased management complexities of an industrial enterprise. So, parallel personnel systems have been set up, multiplying the public service systems, draining skills, leading to disparities in terms and condition of service and resulting in manpower shortages and moral problems. Political considerations often affect the ability to recruit competent managers with special technical skills. In short, nationalization in many instances has often added to the financial burden of the government budget.